Hello, good evening. My name is Holly Joseph and I am the Director of the Centre for Literacy and Multilingualism at the University of Reading. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's event, Multilingualism and Social Justice. I'm sure many of you have attended previous CELM events and already know who we are and what we do. But for those of you who aren't familiar with CELM, I'd just like to say a few words about what we do. So our mission is to work within the field of literacy and multilingualism to conduct research, engage with practitioners and the general public, and train the next generation of researchers. And our research spans 5 interconnected themes: language and literacy, migration, health, education, and neuroscience. And tonight's talk crosses at least 4 of these themes with a particular focus on education, health, and migration. You may know that today is International Mother Language Day, and each year on this day we hold a public lecture to focus on some aspect of multilingualism. You may also know that yesterday was World Social Justice Day, and today's event addresses key links between these 2 important areas of research. So tonight we have 4 wonderful speakers from across different schools in the university who will be sharing their fascinating and varied perspectives on these issues. So first you'll hear from Dr. Naomi Flynn from the Institute of Education, who will talk about some research she did during a recent visit to the United States, looking at multilingual learners in the classroom within a social justice framework. We'll then hear from Dr. Vishnu Nair from the School of Psychology and Clinical Language Sciences, who will talk about social justice in speech and language therapy. Then we'll hear from Dr. Tony Capstick from the Department of English Language and Applied Linguistics, who will tell us about his work on language education in the Global South. And finally, Professor Federico Faloppa from the Department of Languages and Cultures will tell us about multilingualism from the perspectives of multilingual unaccompanied minors. And we also have with us today Professor Ludovica Serratrice from the School of Psychology and Clinical Language Sciences, who will be chairing the second part of today's session, which will be a roundtable discussion. And for this part of today's event, we really want your input. So because this event is a webinar, your microphones are muted and your cameras are off. We do, however, really want to encourage questions and discussion, so please feel free to post at any time throughout the talk. If you have a question for our panel, please make sure you post this in the Q&A section, not in the chat section. And if you wish to comment or ask questions more informally to other attendees, please feel free to do so, but do that in the chat section. So we won't address any of the questions in the chat section to our speakers, just those in the Q&A section. Each of our speakers will talk for about 10 minutes, and then there will be a couple of minutes to ask them any questions of clarification or anything specific to what they've just said. And then when all of our 4 panel members have spoken, there will be about half an hour for a more sort of open question and answer session. Please note that today's event is being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel within a few days. So I think that's all I needed to say. So I will now pass you on to our first speaker, Dr. Naomi Flynn. Thanks, Naomi.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. We'll just wait a moment while I get my slides up. Thanks, Anika, for doing those. So as I've been introduced to already, I am Naomi Flynn and I work with Holly Joseph at the Institute of Education at Reading. And to give you a background to those of you that haven't attended any of my talks before, I am a teacher educator. And during my teaching career, I worked mostly in multilingual settings where there were a lot of multilingual learners. And although I'm a monolingual person myself, it was the multilingual children that just blew me away with the extraordinary things that they achieved. And I just became fascinated by what they brought to the classroom, basically. And so my research has become about multilingual learners. And as Holly explained, I'm going to talk to you about a trip that I made to the USA last year. It's one of a series of trips I've made in order to find out about a particular pedagogy that they're using over there that works with multilingual learners. And so I'm going to, yes, if you can give me the next slide up, that'd be great, Anika. So why is it I've become interested in the US? We have very little UK-based research around what works for multilingual learners in terms of teachers' pedagogy, and that's what I'm interested in looking at, because 21% or around 20% of our learners in classrooms in England and throughout the UK do have what we refer to in England as English as an additional language. Multilingual, I think, is a better phrase because it doesn't prioritize English over other languages. And we share this with the US in that we're both English-speaking nations with large numbers of multilingual learners. Very different histories, obviously, in terms of how those multilingual learners came to be with us or be in our schools, but the issues remain similar in that there are many of these children who are taught in English-speaking classrooms who need a specific pedagogy to support them, but teachers feel underprepared to meet their language learning needs, and this sometimes leads to what many of us might consider very unnecessarily the underattainment of some of these minoritized groups. But in the US, there is a strand of research that has tackled this, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that now. Next slide, please. Thanks, Anika. So the research is carried out by my colleague Anna Latimont, who's a professor of second language learning at Indiana University School of Education in Indianapolis. And it was with her I spent 3 months last summer in a COVID-riven US, finding out more about what it is she's done with teachers. She's been working for about 10 years or so, and some of you will have seen me talk about this before if you've seen some of my other SELM presentations. And you'll perhaps remember that I've been there a couple of times before this 3-month visit. But I wanted to find out more about this thing that she refers to as enduring principles of learning. And the enduring principles of learning basically take into account the things that we know work for multilingual learners in terms of them being language rich, talk rich, genuinely dialogic. And she's built these up over some years as a way of working with teachers to get them to design activities and classroom experiences that are talk rich. I can't go through all of them today because there's lots of them and there's a lot to say about all of them. And I'm going to focus specifically on the one you can see at the bottom there, which is called Critical Stance and is about transforming societal inequities. And in terms of these principles, they kind of rest on this notion of critical stance. So they're not just about how do we teach children in ways that support their English language and their English literature development, which we of course want because they're going to be assessed in that. But how do we do that in ways that value what they bring to the classroom? How do we do that in ways that extend beyond the school gate into children's home lives and celebrate who they are and what they bring, as it were? And that's what Critical Stance is partly about. It's also about getting children to ask questions why, getting them to challenge the reasons for societal inequities, and to find ways of asking, how things could be different. This is quite challenging, but it's something that I've seen develop really well, and I'm going to share with you how that's worked. Just down the right-hand side, just to kind of give you a little bit more information before I move into some pictures of what teachers do. This kind of socio-cultural practice rests on the work of Vygotsky and Robin Alexander, if those of you listening know their work around dialogic teaching, but it's also fueled very much by the work of Paulo Freire, the activist who wrote the wonderful book Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and he talks of teachers' need to engage in dialogue with children, which raises their languages to the fore, as it were, is a dialogue of love. And teachers that teach children who are multilingual by championing their needs are, as it were, armed with a love for them, if you like. It also is underpinned, this way of teaching, by the notion of the linguistically responsive teacher, which is put forward by Tamara Lucas and other her group of other American researchers. And the linguistically responsive teacher is the teacher that wants language and literacy development, but also it is this champion, this person who will foreground, for example, use of home languages, who will know about their children's lives and backgrounds beyond the classroom. So this works in a very practical way, although it's fueled by some very strong principles of how teachers might want to think about their practice. It's also very, very practical. It has a rubric which brings the theory to life. And this has really helped my colleague work with US teachers who are faced with an even more prescriptive curriculum than UK teachers have. So let's look at some of what that looks like. Anika, if you want to go to the next slide, please. So any of you that have watched me talk at any event in the last 3 years will have seen this slide a lot of times, because it's a kind of warm-up slide for how these principles work. And it was watching this back in 2018 that got me very excited about what they had to offer. So this is 3 girls talking together about a book they've chosen. It's called Book Club. They're working with stickies, which they've stuck on the page there, saying one says main idea, one says a question, one is a connection to make, and the other is a vocabulary development, a vocabulary that they want to ask. And they're using those stickies to fuel conversations with their friends. So it's straight away, we've got inquiry-led, pupil-led discourse around a book that they have chosen in a 3 that we know works well for all children, but even more so for perhaps second language, for additional language learners. And they're working also without their teacher. So they've been kind of enabled, empowered, if you like, to work in ways that are socially interactive without their teacher. Okay, next slide, Anika. So what's new on my horizon is, having discovered more of this when I was out last summer. This is another example. This is 7th grade. So those children were 5th grade, which is around our year 6 in England, which is about age 10, 11. These 7th grade are more like age 12, 13. And in this school, they actually use the International Baccalaureate, but working also with these enduring principles of learning. Everything in their curriculum was a question, and it was the question that allowed it to be this kind of inquiry-led curriculum that went beyond just worrying about, are we using the right words, or whose history are we looking at, and more into questions that uncover inequity. So they were looking at patterns of inequity in relationships. What do data tell us about the gap between average wages and the cost of living in the US? Do the ramps in our school comply with requirements of disability legislation? So this is what we mean by this kind of challenging societal inequities. So we're undertaking a curriculum that's talk rich and therefore valuable for our multilingual learners in that way, but also one which allows them to inquire and disrupt the status quo. Next slide, please, Anika. So the next 2 slides are perhaps the most powerful example of this of critical stance that I came across. So this is a 3rd grade an example from 3rd graders who are age kind of 8, 9. Reading curriculum. I said at the beginning that these US teachers are working with an extremely prescriptive curriculum. And you can see from here, it's kind of about American places, American ideals, American are loyal to the idea of freedom, and so on and so forth. And it tells them about what monuments they are in their country that they might value. So that's one way of looking at it if you take it from the book. Let's go to the next slide. So this was a teacher who was working with her 3rd graders actually in virtual teaching during lockdown. And she decided to take this reading unit and turn it a little bit on its head. Same educational outcomes in terms of the children's reading comprehension and vocabulary development and so on, but she turned it into something about their city, about Indianapolis. Indianapolis is full of monuments and landmarks. It has second only in the US to Washington, DC in terms of having those. And she got the children to explore pictures of the monuments and landmarks around their city and say, do they look like you? This in a school where the children were 95% from minoritized groups, 60% or so of those being African-American and the remainder mostly being from Hispanic, Latino Hispanic backgrounds. She got them to look at images of those monuments and then say, okay, the children recognize it doesn't represent who they are. And so she got them therefore to create a landmark that best represented their Indianapolis. And then to think about ways in which they might challenge what the landmarks are like. And one of the things she did, I'm up against the clock here, I can see it's nearly 10 minutes, is she spoke with people from the local historical society about the reasons for landmarks in Indianapolis and the changes that they were working towards at the time. But she got the children to send their pictures with a letter to the mayor to ask him about why the landmarks were as they were and what he could do in order to change them so that they better represented what their lives looked like. So final slide, only just in time. So that's a very, very quick whistle-stop tour, and hopefully we can unpick that a little bit from questions and discussion later. But just so you know, I'm trying to translate this US practice to England at the moment through something called the Talk Rich Teaching Project, which I'm doing with Anika, who's the lovely person doing my slides for me at the moment. And I can give you the link to that in the chat if you want it. I'm going to stop now because I know I'm on time.
Thanks, Naomi. Does anybody have, I can't see any questions in the Q&A, any sort of clarification questions before we move on? I mean, I'm interested in how do we know whether these enduring principles of learning work? Like, what's the way in which that's assessed?
That's such a really good question, and thanks for asking that, Holly. So as I said, my colleague who developed them has been using them over more than 10 years in several states in the US. I think it's important to note that there's no national curriculum in the US. The curriculum is managed at district level. Within a state, you've got districts, and each district has its own curriculum. So she's worked across a number of different districts in different states. And she's able to use pupil outcome data, because a lot more of that is publicly available or available to researchers and is here, and she's able to track those pupils. She uses quasi-experimental design of experimental and control schools, and has tracked improvement in the pupils' scores in language and literacy in particular, with a particular emphasis on children who are multilingual, but also, as it happens, for all children. So this works for children from, who may be minoritized by the school environment for whatever reason, not just linguistic, as it were, reasons. So that's how she's done it. And she's done it using this range of professional development through which she also uses the rubric I referred to, so that she assesses the teacher's practice using that. And she's able to see where the teacher's scores, there are a whole lot of scores associated with the rubric around those principles. And she's able to track where schools improve for lessons, as it were, over time, which is exactly what I'm doing with teachers in England at the moment. Does that answer your question? That was a bit
yes, thank you. It's really interesting. It'd be really interesting to know more about sort of why it works. I mean, maybe that's something we can sort of come back to in the more general discussion, because really that's, I suppose, at the heart of it, isn't it? Like, what is it about this way of doing things that makes a difference? I've just seen a question from Wardas asking, saying, really interesting, why is it called the Talk Rich Project?
Right, that's a great question. So the reason being that there is definitely a problem with the way in which the curriculum in England is dominated by the sense in which you must get children reading and writing. And this militates against multilingual learners, because if you, as any of you listening, because I'm sure you're all invested in this, know that you need to be hearing things, you need to be hearing the language before you can actually use the language. And so if we take talk out of the equation in the classroom, then we're immediately removing access to learning English, access to the curriculum from our multilingual learners. So it's about, how do you make opportunities for talk that will of themselves develop language and literacy. And that might well be talk in L1 in home languages as well, in terms of allowing children room to think about something, conceptually in home languages before trying to talk about it in English, and so on. It could be a range of reasons. Sorry, that's very quick. But it's about dialogic inquiry.
And we all know the importance of allowing children to speak in their home language, don't we? There is another question, but I think we better move on, just in the interest of time, and maybe we'll come back to it a bit later. So next we have Vishnu. Over to you, Vishnu.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay. Yeah. Okay, thank you, Naomi, and thank you, Holly. So my name is Vishnu, and I am a speech and language therapist. So I'm not really going to talk about a specific project per se, but what I'm going to, talk about is the shape of social justice in speech and language therapy. Next slide, please. Anika, can you click next? Yeah, thank you. Okay, so when I think about speech and language therapy, one of the first thing, of course, as a speech and language therapist, that I think about is disability, and especially how disability is constructed. And I have to make a disclaimer when I really link speech and language therapy, disability, and social justice. I don't know if I understand the concept of social justice fully, but for this conversation, let's assume that there is such a thing called social justice. And one of the foundational concepts or foundational knowledges that we gain in speech and language therapy is to think about concepts like social justice, justice, injustice, concept like that in binaries. So let's assume concepts like monolingual, bilingual, white, black as in race, or ability, disability. So all of these concepts are learned in binaries, right? Even our understanding of social justice comes in binaries. And I find a problem. I find it problematic. The reason I find it problematic is because when we think about these abstract concepts in binaries, we are shrinking these concepts from diversity to just two aspects. So if you look at these binaries, monolingual versus bilingual, white versus black and brown, ability versus disability, you know that the first part of binary assumes a superior stand, and the second part of binary assumes a subordinated or an inferior stand in the society. And this is how even the idea of disability is constructed, because disability is something inferior and ability is something superior. Right? Now, if these concepts just remained as abstract concepts, then we wouldn't have a problem and we can intellectually challenge it. But right now, these concepts do have a material effect, because our norm, then all the norms that we create for speech, language, communication is based on this idea that the first part of this binary, which is monolingual, white, and able-bodied, is superior compared to the second part of the binary. So not only this range of diversity in abilities, communication styles, languages, or races is being reduced to binaries, but at the same time, you have also created an artificial norm that assumes that your speech, language, communication, and cognitive ability assumes an idealized standpoint if you are a monolingual, white, and able-bodied. Next slide, please. Okay, now like I said, the material effect of this is pretty violent, I would call, because we know that children who deviate from this norm, which is monolingual, white, and able-bodied, multilingual children, multilingual black and brown children, are overrepresented and underrepresented in special education services. And we don't even have the statistics for that in speech and language services. And even when standardized testing is created in multilingual children, it is still based on this ideology that multilingual children or bilingual children have to act like two monolinguals in one mind. Again, there is a monolingual ideology at place. So institutions create this standard, and especially SLT, speech language therapy, as an institution, as an academy, create this standard for communication that is based on a white supremacist ideology. And this is not only leading to racialized multilingual children face linguistic oppression, but any conversation on race is absent in the field. And any conversation on the intersection between race, multilingualism, and disability is absent. This colorblind ideologies are pervasive. So I don't see any social justice as it is practiced in speech and language therapy right now. I only see injustice, and I mean I should have named it as injustice. And I call this injustice in the form of a multi-headed beast. That's what I tend to think of it as. Next slide, please. And once these children are in the system, there's a good amount of work that comes from the United States, especially by Maria Choi Pena, who wrote these children who are labeled by the system as having disabled. So the disability is constructed based on these binaries. And you know, the material effect of that is once these children are in the system, their families are also decentered. What do I mean by that? let's for a moment you assume that if you are a bilingual who speaks one of those Western European languages, like if you're a French English bilingual, of course your bilingualism is valued. But the moment if you're a bilingual who speak one of those languages like Bengali, of course your bilingualism is devalued. And imagine that bilingualism when if you are in a racialized body and if your bilingualism is intersecting with disability, what agencies do the families have? And Choi Penier's work clearly talks about when these families are faced with the system, they sometimes know, and a lot of families do know, that their children don't have a disability. They are just being labeled by the system, but they don't have any agency because they are mostly poor or racialized migrant families. So this co-construction of race, language, and disability pushing these families to the margins. Next slide, please. And again, we don't have any data of, I mean, this is documented well in the United States, but we don't have any data of this in the UK. And I started collecting stories from minoritized SLTs in the UK. And this is this is a story from my dear colleague and friend, Wada Farah, who you may have listened 2 weeks ago. And this is a story when she was working as an SLT in London a few years ago. So I'm not really going to read the whole story, but I'm just going to repeat the gist of it. So a few years ago, she was working in London as a speech and language therapist, and she was working in an area which was predominantly, which is predominantly immigrants and also immigrants who are pretty much a racialized community. And she met with this client. I mean, she was referred to this child, Hassan, who was 8 years. And Farah knew that this child did not need any kind of intervention, right? And when she pushed back against it, the special education coordinator really got annoyed and asked her, if you are saying there is nothing wrong with him, why are you working with him? Why is he failing? He's behind everything. He never listens to us. He never pays attention. There's something wrong with him. To that, she responds, no, there is something wrong with you. There's something wrong with the way the school is run, something wrong with how you label and classify immigrant children who do not blindly follow your lead. The fact that you have so many little brown children like Hassan failing, needing assessments and evaluations from professionals, lets me know that it is not the children who are the problem, but the system you have in place. To this, the inclusion officer interrupts and says, yes, we have a problem here. We have over 60 children on the special education register. And we need a different way to look at these children, right? And all of this is happening, and Hassan's mother sits there silently. And this is a theme that even comes across in Choi Penier's book, right? The agency of these parents are compromised, succumbing their agency to the system. Next slide, please. So when I have to really think about what is the way forward, I mean, or the shape of social justice, I don't have answers to all the questions. And I can only talk about a little bit in 10 minutes. But people like Farah, who is racialized and who has a lived experience of being Black in the UK. So of course, with her lived experience, she can push back. She has that awareness to push back against the system, right? But we don't learn this even in our curriculum, in our pedagogy, in our classrooms. So as an educator, I think about how do we recalibrate our training itself to talk about these critical issues, to talk about these paradigms that are violent towards Black and brown children, right? We definitely need a more humane approach to the profession to even look at how many children are being labeled, how many children are being giving services when they really don't need any services. And for those children from racialized background who genuinely need some kind of a communication support, can we really think about, or can we connect our practices to their home and community? Can we center the family? Can we really think about or consider the family as not just testimonial providers just right after the therapy, But as real expert, can we really look at the ideologies that are really foundational, which are racist, really foundational to this profession? Can we redefine what we call intervention language assessment and how we construct disability? Maybe if we can shake the system, maybe if we can disrupt these ideologies and interrogate them, maybe we will know the shape of social justice in speech language therapy. Thank you.
Thank you, Vishnu. That was fantastic. We've got a question. I'll just have to read it out because I won't be able to sort of skim it. And so it says, thank you for your inspiring talk. Can you talk a little bit about your vision for being global communication and connections while moving away from Eurocentric linguistic and dialectic norms? That is, how can we still engage with different parts of the world without insisting children having to learn standardized forms of English at some point in their lives?
That's a very very complex question, and I think it's a very critical question. I do think that when we talk about these issues, we only think about global north because this is where we focus on, and these issues are very prevalent in global south. And one of the things that I tend to think of as standardized testing. Like, I come from India, where there are more than 1,600 languages spoken. How do we create any kind of standards in that kind of a country, right? I mean, I tend to think about it. So even this thing called standardized testing, the more Black and brown children we send into the system, the more standardized testing we create, and who is making profit out of it. These are pertinent questions, and what are the implications for global south when we think about this system. So I think it is a conversation that the field needs to have in terms of what do we even my language assessment, how do we calculate deviance, how do we calculate norm, can we see these children as beyond disability categories, and to really look at what are the genuine communication needs that these children have, like, look at what the family wants rather than going there as a therapist and fixing it. So these are conversation, I think, that should, I mean, I think this conversation is happening right now, but I think much more of that needs to happen, thinking from a global Southern perspective as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, let's move on. I'm sure there will be, I'm just checking, yeah. I'm sure there'll be more questions in the main panel discussion. So let's move on now to Tony. I can't see you, Tony. Oh, there you are. Yeah, over to you, Tony.
Thanks, Holly. Can you hear me okay? Great. Thanks to Naomi and Vishnu as well for such fascinating talks. I hope I'm going to be able to address some of the issues that Vishnu and Naomi raised, and also the question that somebody had just popped in the chat to Vishnu, I think does speak to what hopefully I'm going to be talking about, which is addressing some of these kind of standardized approaches to language use. How do we categorize different language varieties? How do we recognize that these categories often put boundaries around languages that are actually very fluid practices? And how do we sort of understand these kind of relationships in the parts of the global south that people have already mentioned this evening? So Anika, if you could just, there we go, thank you. So one of the ways that I work in this kind of critical paradigm, trying to understand multilingualism from a critical perspective, is trying to establish early on in research and in teacher education projects just what we mean by multilingualism. And there are many different definitions, but the one that I work with is that when we talk about different language varieties, we're always talking about the ideologies that frame those varieties. So we need to look at the particular context that we're working in order to be able to understand how different languages have different levels and different status in that specific context. So if we're talking about a classroom full of learners who bring different linguistic resources to the learning of English, for example, then how does that language ecology work? what different prestige do those different language varieties have, and how do teachers become more aware of the different hierarchies of those languages? Now, this all sounds quite complex, and I think it can be a very confusing area to work in when teachers are dealing with something like the kind of prescriptive curricula that Naomi mentioned. How do we help them understand, how do we help teachers understand some of this kind of diversity, the linguistic diversity, as well as the relationship between different language varieties that they meet in their day-to-day kind of classroom teaching? So I'm going to take this critical perspective to understanding multilingualism. Okay, Anika, next slide, please. And a sort of area of research that's emerging now is work on translanguaging. Now, translanguaging has become quite popular in different areas of language pedagogy and teacher training, as well as in social linguistics. But really, when you look at what those early scholars using this term meant, they meant something very political. They didn't mean code switching. This isn't mixing between Urdu and Punjabi or Urdu and English in a classroom setting. This is actually recognizing that when people use Urdu and English in a classroom, they're also activating their cultural knowledge, they're framing different identities, and they're bringing cultural expertise into their learning. So it's a transformative way of understanding language learning. And Alistair Pennycook's work is really, I find it very helpful here, because he argues for language educators, many of us, to be more aware of our opportunities for translingual activism. And so how do we equip our learners with the skills and knowledge that enables them to become proficient in the target language, if it's English, whilst also building on their existing linguistic repertoire? So bringing into that classroom environment the kinds of languages that they're already familiar with, and using those to scaffold the learning of English. And also recognizing that as language teachers, we also have a responsibility to understand the different discourses, the different registers, and the different styles. We often think of English as this one bounded entity, but actually when we use English, we're using English in all of its different variations. So we're using different styles for different purposes. We're using different registers, whether in an academic setting or whether using social media. So there's a lot going on here, but the work that I do with teachers and teacher educators in the Middle East and in South Asia tries to work with teachers when designing materials that help them understand some of these changes in the ways that we understand language pedagogy. Next slide, please, Anika. So what I'm going to do for the next few minutes is introduce very briefly some of the material that I've been working on with fellow teacher educators in the countries neighboring Syria. So these are teacher trainers who are based in Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and in Turkey. And together we've been designing materials to help teachers cope with the massive displacements and the massive migrations that are going on in that part of the world, because as you are all very aware, teachers are often at the front line of having to help displaced learners fit into their new neighborhoods, into their new classroom settings. And so how do we work with teachers to help them understand some of this diversity? I'm going to talk about 4 modules that we've designed together. The first is about culture in the classroom. And what you can see here is a snapshot of a training manual that we've worked on, which helps those trainee teachers start to understand how culture influences language learning and language teaching. And so we include issues around identity and how identities are often shifting. We look at teacher identity and what it means to understand yourself as a teacher of refugees and migrants. So we start by looking at culture in the very early stages, so that as we develop through the different modules, we're able to build on that cultural knowledge as we go along. Next slide, please, Anika. By beginning with culture, I think it puts us in a stronger position to then deal with some of the more controversial, although absolutely essential, but controversial aspects of language education. Vishnu talked passionately about challenging those monolingual ideologies, about interrogating some of the categories that we use when we teach and when we test. And so we need to look at discrimination. We need to look at how discrimination occurs in classroom settings. We need to help teachers understand that when you have learners from different backgrounds, we all bring our biases, our prejudices, and our stereotypes to those classroom interactions. We don't want to deny them. We don't want to sort of suggest that we're not bringing these biases, but how do we recognize them? And how do we help teachers understand how best to deal with them in classroom settings where we're dealing with all of this kind of complexity? So we look at what stereotypes are, we identify that they're mental categories, we identify where they come from, and how we can challenge some of the prejudices that all of us bring to our work together. Okay, next slide, please, Anika. So we've talked about culture. We understand that culture is something shifting, and that it, particularly in settings where there are many displaced learners and teachers, how culture influences the identities of our learners. And then we've put that within the context of different discriminatory practices. The third set, oh, sorry, this is intercultural competencies. So once we've established that we bring our biases to our classrooms, we then want to help teachers understand how to engage in the kinds of dialogues that can move us beyond those stereotypes. So in order to fight the kind of discrimination that I've already referred to, we introduce concepts like empathy and what it means to be an empathetic teacher, what it means to move towards more empathetic kind of ways of understanding classroom relationships. And that puts us on a path to exploring issues around ethno-relativism. So again, we often think of our own cultural practices as the norm, and this is all a very regular part of how we interact as humans. But actually, when we come into classrooms where there is a lot of diversity, people from post-conflict and conflict settings, then we need to understand a little bit about how we might move towards more intercultural ways of working. And so we identify what intercultural means, and we look at these kind of intercultural competencies, how we can become better negotiators in a classroom setting, and how we can move away from these ethnocentric views of culture towards more kind of ethno-relativist ways of talking to each other. Okay, next slide, please, Anika. So I'll end with this slide because I've kind of hopefully done the full circle here. Rather than start with multilingualism in our teacher training modules, we actually end with multilingualism because we feel that we need to have done all of that work on culture and identity and intercultural learning before we can really help those teachers who ultimately are going to become language teachers, how we can help them understand multilingualism as a resource, and how we can help them move towards these kind of translanguaging pedagogies, the sorts of classroom-based strategies where we use the different linguistic resources of our learners to scaffold the learning of the target language, if that is English. You may be wondering, why am I talking about English in countries like Iraq and Lebanon? Well, now, for all sorts of political and complex reasons, English is a dominant language in these schools, in universities, in those parts of the world. And these are not decisions that teachers make. These are decisions that ministries of education make, and then teachers have to be able to respond to those decisions. They need to get their learners through these classroom curricula. So we end with multilingualism because it helps them build on these resources, and it helps them move towards the target language, which is often a dominant language, such as English. Okay, I will finish on that note.
Thanks, Tony. So how has this sort of gone down with teachers? Have they sort of appreciated the sort of order in which you've done it? And do you think it's helped to go through things about empathy and discrimination before getting to multilingualism? It
seems to have worked well. We piloted them before COVID. We piloted them in refugee camps on the Ethiopia South Sudan border with teachers of refugee teachers who were teaching refugees from many different backgrounds. And we also piloted them in Jordan. I was only at the Ethiopia pilots, and they went down well. I think what teachers felt difficult to sort of I guess they felt the difficulty was moving from one module to the next quite quickly. What we decided to do after the pilot was have quite an extensive gap in between each module, so that the teachers could reflect, go back to their classrooms, try out some of the activities, try out some of the different strategies, reflect on how well those strategies worked or didn't work, and then bring that kind of reflection back to the next module, so they were able to sort of build on what they were learning and try things out. The constraints are always financial, and it was very difficult to be able to run the modules with that kind of gap in between. But I think that was probably how it would best be rolled out in the future.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we've got 15 minutes, Federico. Over to you. Can't see you. There you are.
I'll try to do my best. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I was very happy to hear my colleagues, also because, I tried to follow up some ideas and concepts and reflections they just shared with us. The title of my presentation is Multilingualism, Mother Tongues Through and Accompanying Foreign Minors' Perspectives. And next slide, please, Annika. Thank you very much. And I start immediately from a football match in Palermo that was recorded in June 2020. I'm not describing the slide to you. You can go through it. I invite you to go through the slide and read yourself, the different kind of participants and the languages and the countries of origin. I'm just translating that conversation, which is quite funny, actually, because Ansu says, this is fault. This is a fault. And Gaucho, no, this is not a fault. And then Sniper, I just wanted to kick the ball. And then Gaucho again, referee, what is that? Is it a fault or not? And then in Italian, also using Italian. And then the referee, yeah, that's a fault, in my opinion. And then Lamina, ironic, you're very smart, are you a referee? Yeah, you're just, saying that is a fault. And Kemo, yeah, but actually, come close to him, because he's pretending that he was fooled by another player. Again, you just can go through it. It's very funny. It was a real conversation in a football during a football match. And as you can see, it's a multilingual conversation that was recorded by my friend and colleague, Professor Mario D'Agostino at the University of Palermo, that has just published an amazing book on these items. And actually, from that football match, we can have an idea that what we have in Palermo now in terms of multilingual conversation is real. And in these kind of conversations, like multilingual from different people from different countries, we are talking about young people and accompanying minors, actually people that got to Italy as an accompanying minors, and then they found new friends in Italy. And they're communicating with several languages to each other. Next slide, please. And so that kinds of those kind of conversations actually help us understand the reality of migration, of people migrating and migrating to Italy and landing in Sicily, and then use their own language repertoires and competence is changing, has changed in time, and particularly in the last few years. And so we have quite a few questions if we want to better understand what happens in terms of multilingual conversation and dynamics in Italy and in Europe from these people coming from different countries. And so, for instance, we should ask ourselves, particularly when we talk about unaccompanied foreign minors, what are the variables that we need to look at? What are the countries of origin, but not just the countries of origins, and so the social linguistic backgrounds that we can find there, but also the countries, the so-called transit countries, which are now called stopover countries, not by chance, and also the different countries of destinations. What are the different networks that are being activated in these different countries? And sometimes we talk about 16, 18, 24 months of journey from the country of origin to the country of destination. So it's a long time. So why stopover is relevant to us? Because in these stopover countries, they also practice their languages. They're not just using the repertoire that they had in the country of origin, they acquire new languages, and also they improve their competences, and they stay there maybe for a long time in order to get some money and to keep the journey, to keep going. And then what are the routes they are following? What are the different routes, and for how long? Are they traveling alone as minors or with other people? Are they meeting friends and creating new solidarities across, along the journey, or at the started the journey alone or with other people? And that's another key point to us. And so what are the different trajectories or plans when they start their migratory journey? Are they do they want to stay in one country? Are they just improvising step by step? When they land in a place, do they want to stay there, or they want to move maybe to another country? The IOM, so the International Organization for Migration, in 2019 said that 27% of young migrants now coming from sub-Saharan African countries are, basically don't have any relative in Europe. So they start the journey without that kind of connection in Europe. And they are called the new wave of pioneers, new pioneers. And they don't belong to any diasporic migration, actually. Next slide, please. And so just to follow up what Vishnu and Tony said, actually, we need to ask ourselves if the terminology we use when we tackle these issues is the correct one. So what is the meaning that we give the word multilingual? We have different definitions, and Tony already mentioned a couple of them, but multilingual and multilingualism, is that an individual ability, or maybe it's a social ability, as the European Commission says? So it entails also, social kind of engaging with social or institutional kind of realities and organizations. But if we talk about individual multilingualism versus social multilingualism, shouldn't we talk about plurilingualism or the repertoire rather than just the knowledge of the language, as Tony said? But also maybe we want to use multi-competence instead of multilingualism, because we're not just talking about language, we're talking about cultural approaches, we're talking about meta-linguistic, meta-language competencies, and meta-language knowledge that is going to be very helpful when they travel across different countries. And so maybe also the concept of mobile linguistic resources could be a useful one instead of multilingualism. So in order to challenge terminology and to understand better what's going on. Next slide, please. And also, in order to challenge or even to reverse the approach and the perspective, we should look at the so-called language diversity index. Vishnu mentioned that already. And also Tony said that we have the monolingual kind of approach and framework in mind. But actually, when we talk about sub-Saharan countries, and these are the countries I'm more familiar with when I talk about my own research, we talk about countries where the language diversity index is very high, is very different from the index that we have in Europe or in other countries. Diversity is the normality there. So speakers from this country are really familiar with several mother tongues or several languages, and then also with other language they use functionally in their society, and then after they leave their country of origin. Next one, please. And so when we look at sub-Saharan countries and unaccompanied minors coming from these sub-Saharan countries, and if we want to use a different terminologies, not just multilingualism, but linguistic repertoires and flexible mobile resources from a linguistic point of view, actually we have this kind of context, the starting point. Small-scale multilingualism, particularly between Senegal and Gambia, for instance, one of the areas where we have this small-scale multilingualism. Multilingualism is part of the everyday practice of the speakers, and they don't even perceive it as switching from one language to the next, L1 or L2 or L3. They just use this very common practice of mixing up languages. Actually, not just mixing up languages, but speaking languages and then getting feedback in other languages, but they understand each other because of the patrimonial languages, and that's another expression which can be very productive for us. So the oral competence of several languages, even if the level of standardization is very low, and also the literacy level may be very low in this for these speakers, particularly the unaccompanied minor speakers that haven't finished a normal kind of a traditional kind of education pathway. And so the coexistence of different linguistic repertoires in a limited space, also within the family. And translanguaging, I'm not indulging on that. Tony has already explained to us what translanguaging is, but also in terms of competence, they're not particularly interested in being proficient in many languages. They're just interested in being functional, functionally communicating in several languages. So the idea of proficiencies that we have when we start from a monolingual kind of perspective is not particularly applicable to them and to their own knowledge and background. And so the continuous negotiation of codes and communicative aims in their everyday interactions, the equal, and again, Tony mentioned that, equal sociolinguistic stages among languages. They don't perceive a different stages when they use 4, 5, 6 different languages in their everyday space. And also the importance, and that's very important when they travel, when they start a journey, of the so-called cross-border languages, i.e. 41 languages recognized by the African Academy of Languages as cross-border. So we don't have the equation nation state and language. These languages can really are transnational. The next one, please. And so, just to give you an example very quickly, because time flies, but this is Mohammed's linguistic autobiography, actually, as an accompanying minor that landed in Sicily. As you can see, from Gambia, he was very, was multilingual, but he didn't finish, he didn't complete his education, and so he had a low literacy level, but he learned several languages with different people in different contexts, also within the family. He learned some Arabic by heart in Quranic schools, and that's going to be very useful to him when he needs to learn Italian, for instance, but just by repeating sequences of Italian, strings of Italian language in Italian schools, for instance. So the different abilities activated by different languages for different kind of purposes and functions. The next one, please. And I'm about to finish. So our questions are, if we take into account these, these backgrounds or these flexible mobile competences and repertoires or resources, as we call them, how could we map actually these resources? So what do we mean by mother tongues if we talk about their own context, the original context, the countries of origin? What are the practices in terms of translanguaging, also outside the school, the classroom, not just inside the classroom, which is even more important for people that haven't finished their education, education pathway. And then new languages added to the repertoire during the journey. Also the importance of stopover countries, so they get familiar or friends with other people, and they use transnational or cross-border languages in order to communicate. New varieties of these languages are added, not just the language, but also the different varieties in order to be able to better communicate with each other. The reactivation of dormant competences, also something that got learned, when they were kids, but then is activated again, some French maybe, or some English, but that was not, developed later. Acquisition of literacy in what language? In what language? In the so-called stopover countries or in the destination countries? And then the functional reuse of, for instance, of classic Arabic, as I said, new languages when they come to the countries of destination, but also the different so-called dialects of these new languages. In Palermo, unaccompanied minors are reactivating and revitalizing the local dialects in the town center, which is neglected and stigmatized by the locals, the local population. And then the use of the lingua franca, also what kind of lingua franca Hausa use in Nigeria, but also for people that didn't speak Hausa, but learned some Hausa in order to communicate during the journey and then to create new solidarities in the destination country. The very last slide, and I conclude, is then the questions. And also I try to answer some of these questions myself in some research projects in Multimind, which is a research network financed by the European Union, but also Kiko's system. And I published a paper, multilingualism, for different countries by other migrants in different schools, in different contexts. So to challenge also the idea of multilingualism that we have in Europe, in order to see if this is applicable to their context inside the classroom and outside the classroom. And so also to talk about the diasporic movements. Do they belong to a diasporic movement or not? What do we know about the new migrations, particularly by unaccompanied minors? If they move alone, if they travel alone, and they create and recreate solidarities, ties to other people, what is the language or language networks they need to activate step by step up to the country of destination or destinations, several countries, if they want to keep moving. And also other languages are related to traumas. And so maybe they learn some Arabic in Libya, but they don't want to use Arabic any longer because this is traumatic for them when they land and when they get to the country of destination. And so linguistic networks, and just to conclude and to follow, really to follow up what Tony said, this is also maybe also useful for us, not just in stopover countries or in transit countries, but also in the destination countries, in Italy, in Greece, in Germany, in order to train teachers and to train teachers about this multilingual, flexible, fluid competence or resources that can be enabled also at a meta-language level, in order to facilitate not just the acquisition of new languages, but the communication of these people in the new societies, to make them citizens and not just learners in a classroom. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Federico. Beautifully timed. I thought that just really came round so well to what Vishnu was saying, early on about the idea of imposing, the people who, often maybe speak just one language, English, kind of imposing upon people with much, much more sophisticated, linguistic repertoires and telling them if they're okay or if they're not okay, when actually, monolingual speakers, could be looking the other way to learn from these people. Okay, so I'm going to pass over to Ludovica now to have a look at what questions have been asked.
Oh, thank you, Holly. Well, thanks to all the speakers, as Holly said, I think, this was pretty mind-blowing. And I really love that map that Federico, you showed us. Sorry, I've got a bit of a recency effect here, so obviously haven't listened to you last. The linguistic diversity index, I think, that one picture tells all that, I'm sure we all looked at the shading of the UK, right? And although we do say we're a multilingual society, we're a multilingual country, I don't think we have any idea what we're talking about when we are comparing ourselves to truly multilingual societies. So I have some things that I maybe want to ask all of you later, but I think I probably better start with the questions that have come from our attendees. So I've got a question here that I think I will sort of read first, because it's a question to the panel from here, Data, who's been very active. So thank you so much for your contributions in the chat and in the Q&A. So he's asked, can the speakers characterize multilingualism and multidialectalism and their relationship to race, status, and equity in the United States versus the United Kingdom versus Europe as a whole? So you've got 27 minutes for this. So take as long as you need. So I don't know. So I don't know where here is based, perhaps in the States. I'm not so sure. So again, do you think there are the same problems that apply in the States versus the United Kingdom versus Europe? I don't know. I mean, I guess we've got perspectives here from everywhere. So I don't know. Again, I know maybe Vishnu, because you've made this transition from the US to Europe / the UK
more recently, and I guess Naomi as well. So perhaps you two maybe can speak more to the US United Kingdom comparison, and maybe Federico and Tony can speak a little bit more from, you know, the European side versus the rest of the world side, perhaps versus the UK. I don't know, just a thought, considering where you're all physically coming from. I don't know who wants to start. Anyone in particular?
I'll say something, put you out of your misery. Thanks for the question. It's a really deep question, and I'm not sure I can do it much justice. And it's probably why the rest of us are sitting there a bit thinking with our thinking hats on. I mean, I guess I can only show you, because I'm a practitioner, although I am a researcher as well, obviously, I got a very practical practitioner view of this. And I think I would say that the issues around multilingualism between the US and the UK do share commonality in that English is perceived, as we know and have explored through all the 4 talks that we've had this evening, as the, you know, the one that carries the most cultural and social capital, and therefore the one that we all have to learn. And this undeniably then minoritizes or reduces the standing and the status of the other languages that children in the classroom may have, even, for example, in schools, I would say, where you couldn't possibly describe a language as minority because all the children are using it. So you know, Spanish, for example, in the US, or I don't know, a number of different languages in the UK, you'd find schools where you'd have like Bengali speaking children in schools in Tower Hamlets, or Polish speaking children in schools in Slough. So I think there is similarity in the way in which English dominates, in the way in which that therefore makes us as practitioners define what it is to be multilingual. And it reflects a little bit about what Tony was saying, I think, and Feda, really, in terms of multilingualism being a term that we might use whereby we're assuming that that person still wants to learn English and perhaps use English first, over, you know, in terms of hierarchy above the rest of their languages. So yes, I think there's commonality. The ways in which it might be tackled in other systems are different in the different countries, so that's where there might be differences. I'm going to stop now, and I wonder if someone else is going to say something.
Vishnu, do you want to go next?
Yeah.
From the US?
I know it's a complex question once again, and I don't know if I can think about it in the right way right now, but this is what I'm thinking. And like Naomi said, I think there are commonalities in the sense that the question related to whether how the race and multilingualism intersects, and I do think there's an intersection there. But I also think that we should also look at commonalities around globally, because right now there is an imposition of standard language ideology. Like I can talk about India, for instance. Like we never separated languages like L1, L2, L3. This compartmentalization of languages, it's a very new thing, you know. So we need to really look at what, you know, Tony definitely talked about translanguaging, the language as one holistic system, and how we play with it as creatively, right? And that's the kind of idea, I mean, that's kind of way in which we have to move. But that system, I mean, that kind of thinking is very much penalized in the school system, right? If you use your 2 languages, then of course it is considered to be non-standard, and that is same in the UK, that is same in the US, and that has a race component. Right, the race component is like the Latinx children, the Black children, the brown children. I mean, the same everywhere. So how do we then think beyond that standardized ideology and create pedagogies that accounts for these children's you know, home language and the creativity, the rich languages? I think those are pertinent questions, and there's a clear intersection between these race and bilingualism.
Thank you, Vishnu. I don't know if Tony and Federico have got something to add.
Could I just add one? I'm not sure if any of us have mentioned it yet, and that's socioeconomic class. So we're assuming an awful lot when we talk about other identities, whether they're gendered or sexual orientation, race, ethnicity. But obviously, marginalization occurs where social and economic classes really kind of shaping the kinds of classroom interactions or societal interactions that we're all very interested in. And so what we might find is that certain language varieties actually have more status depending on the kind of, you know, linguistic capital they have in that setting. So away from classrooms, we can find that, you know, what might be perceived as minority language varieties in one context have a lot of power in other contexts. This is something that studying migration enables us to see a lot more clearly, that English in some migrant families will have a lot of capital when it comes to finding a job and getting a qualification. But actually those home language varieties are really important when it comes to choosing a husband, or you know, those intergenerational kind of relationships. So again, it's by looking at how all of these different identity categories intersect within that kind of, you know, linguistic market that we're able to say something meaningful about what kind of status each of them has.
May I add something? Thank you. You know, thinking of Italy, since I mentioned that, I think there are a couple of paradoxes that may be relevant to this discussion. Italy as a country got unified very recently, and so the language, Italian language, spoken language, got standardized very recently. And so Italy is a multilingual country, it's been a multilingual country for centuries. Now, you know, the ideology is that if you go to a school, if you start learning Italian, you move from your L1 to Italian, i.e. from L1 to L2, and you need to switch. And that's the ideology, and that's also the pedagogical kind of approach in most of schools, of the schools that, you know, we have in Italy. But from the unaccompanied minor perspectives, and particularly that, you know, those unaccompanied minors coming from those countries where the multilingual kind of resources are so very common, and, you know, in their everyday life, you know, they bring that kind of competence and knowledge. They are not enabled to use that in the classroom, but actually they can speak 5, 6, 7 different languages from a meta linguistic point of view. They are much quicker and smarter, let me use that, you know, than monolingual speakers of Italian, but they are penalized in the classroom. And so we have the two paradoxes: a country that was multilingual, but ideologically became monolingual very recently, that is looking at multilingualism or plurilingualism with a sort of bias, i.e. no, you should switch from L1 to L2. The reality now, through migration, and particularly through the new kinds of, you know, dynamics, is that we have a lot of multilingual speakers that, as you said already, you know, maybe they don't want to study Italian, they're just transiting through Italy. They want to have some kind of Italian to be, you know, to be useful for that kind, you know, everyday interactions they have, but they use other lingua franca, they use other, you know, competencies, and schools for them are really penalizing, you know. And so how can we activate, enable them to use their resources, but also how can we use this kind of approach to reverse our, you know, methodological and I could say academic approach to multilingualism versus monolingualism. And that's at stake, in my opinion. So we can really use that kind of research, these practices, also to update our methodologies and terminologies when we go to schools and to pedagogical kind of, you know, materials and practices. So yeah, these paradoxes are, in my opinion, are fruitful, but we need to take them into account, and we need to unpack them in order to create, you know, a proper discussion around these topics.
Thank you very much, Federico. I just want to say, like, play devil's advocate here for a minute. And, you know, all of us on this panel, we're always talking about multilingualism, about the beauty of being able to speak many different languages, about our multilingual identities. But here we are, e non stiamo parlando in italiano, spagnolo, Urdu, Hindi, or whatever. We're all speaking in English, right? So I think, you know, I feel that there is a double standard because we're constantly talking about this. And then we're going to umpteen conferences about multilingualism. We create International Mother Language Day events like this one. And we're not doing any translanguaging here. We're still following back on our professional English-speaking persona, and those of us who are not native speakers of English are putting on our best, imitation of a British English accent, since, we were taught in the UK. So I just wonder, again, to what extent, and I think, this also, we're all educators, not in primary school, and maybe Naomi a bit of both, but, in the university education sector, but we're still complicit in this system, right? Because from our university students, we may be preaching the gospel of multilingualism, but when we're correct, when we're grading their assignments, we're still expecting correct standard English, right? So I don't know, how do we sort of square this tension? Because at the end of the day, Naomi has talked to us about these pedagogical approaches which really value multilingualism, and at the end of the day, I mean, I don't know the US system, but I assume that, like the UK system, these children will have to score well on standard American English versus standard British English. So how do, and if these children don't do that, they don't get good qualifications, they don't get good jobs. So how do we square this terrible tension between doing what we know is right and being pragmatic in the system that we're living in right now? This is a very difficult question. We don't have enough time, but I don't know. This is something that really bothers me a lot.
Can I say something in response? Because you've described that beautifully, Ludo. I mean, a very quick response from me. There is work now that helps language educators enable their learners to become better speakers and writers of multiple languages. So, for example, in my work as an English language teacher trainer, that there is material that we can use with teachers, training teachers and in-service teachers to help their learners master the genres that they need to write an academic essay in English and get a good mark, whilst also, as I said before, kind of scaffolding the other linguistic resources in their repertoires. It is, you need decent classroom material to be able to do that. Teachers need to know how to be able to plan a lesson that enables all of those different resources to have a stake and a role in that learning of the target language or the target genre or register. But there is material, and I can share that material with people if they're interested. I can put some resources, some list of resources together that shows classroom teachers how to use and target a range of different genres, registers and styles.
Okay. Oops, sorry, Vishnu.
Yeah, I'll just add one line. Hopefully, no, I know it's going to be more than one line, but there is a whole work around critical pedagogy and culturally sustaining practices where children, these home languages are brought into the classroom. So there's a huge body of work, and people have shown that just by bringing these home languages into the classroom and their cultures, these children do not fare badly on standardized testing. So we need to, so these are not contradictory approaches. We need to really keep that in mind. Yes, that hasn't happened. Like translanguaging is that, right? So it hasn't happened a lot in clinical practices like speech and language therapy, but it has happened in pedagogy, and there's a whole body of work in the US based on that.
Naomi, maybe you can say something about this.
Yes, thank you, Vishnu. You basically just described what the enduring principles of learning are all about, and they do absolutely rest on that great US research. I think it's really interesting. Sorry, I'm not going to lose sight of your question, Ludo, that both Vishnu and I referred to research in both our professions as mostly coming from the US. And that's part of our issue in the UK, is that we're so largely, a lot of us are monolingual. That's an issue in terms of the teaching profession. People like me, for example, are a problem. And policy is a massive problem. So teachers who want to do the best, as it were, are hamstrung by policy, and they can try and break free, but it is really hard. But that kind of starting with, pedagogy from kind of sociocultural principles, as Vishnu was saying, does seem to be making the difference. And the work that Tony was talking about is very interesting, because Tony was saying that he starts his teacher education through looking at culture and what culture is and cultural identity before you start looking at language. And indeed, the work that I'm doing, when it sits in the US, where it's very much more finely tuned than what I'm doing in the UK at the moment, does start from that point of view. It's about who are you, what do you value in your classroom, whose values are they? And so the bigger picture of languages is part of that. It goes back to the previous question, actually, really, about kind of the intersectionality around language and race and social class as well. So what am I saying? I'm saying that it's a problem that there's testing in English. And yes, we do have to educate our children to pass those tests, because otherwise we fail them in the education system. But alongside that, we need these approaches that that champion who they are, in order that they leave the education system thinking, yes, you know, I am that person, I can be that person, rather than I can't be that person because of the extent to which I've been minoritized, or, you know, I don't know, reduced in some way by the system. Yeah, but also we need more research in the UK amongst teachers and SLTs. And we need, you know, people to put their hand up and say yes when we say we want to come into your spaces to do that. And we need funding. I'm going to shut up now because I've gone on there.
Fede, do you want to say something?
Yeah, very, very quickly. I mean, something about multilingual practices that I saw myself, you know, in Palermo a few years ago. And Tony, probably you were there, I don't remember, but that was a chunk of the Odyssey put on stage in different languages from, you know, by migrants. And so there were two people, unaccompanied minors at the time. Actually, one of them was already 18, but reciting in Bambara. And that was not even their mother tongue. They learned Bambara as a lingua franca during, you know, for them during the travel, you know, as a solidarity kind of time. Then there was the choir provided by the local college in ancient Greek, and then some kind of Sicilian dialect by the two migrants, the two, you know, guys playing the main characters, that was mixed, you know, with the Bambara. And of course, you know, this is not helping them learn many languages, other languages, but this is giving them one key item, in my opinion, that even them, without speaking Italian, with you know, with low literacy level, can put on stage a chunk of the Odyssey, which means that in their language, in Bambara, the Odyssey can be told, which means that the local audience, the Sicilian local audience, even if the audience doesn't understand what they say, they are familiar with the text. So they can activate a kind of understanding, which means that for them, they're landed in Sicily with low literacy level, without much knowledge of Italian or no knowledge of Italian, with their kind of multilingual competence, you know, for them was, all right, we have the right also to, you know, we have a voice, right? We can put on stage that text in Sicily, in Palermo, with our own resources, linguistic resources, which means that they enable, at least from a meta-language point of view, to, you know, to activate their competence and also to be recognized as speakers, as voices, which means that in terms of results, and one of them now is doing their university in Palermo in Italian, right? He landed and he didn't speak a word in Italian. Now he's completing his university in Italian in Palermo, which means that the status which is recognized to them is a high status as much as the Italian language. And that's, in my opinion, even if it's not enabling them immediately to speak other languages or to be competent of Italian, is enabling them to be seen as speakers with their own competence and meta competence, which is then helping them, you know, reaching the next level, the next step. Thank you.
Grazie, Federico. Molto chiaro. Okay, so thank you very much. I think, you know, these are very complex questions, and, you know, you've given complex but, you know, clear answers to the extent that it is possible to do that in 5 minutes. I think this is more, I mean, I always see these mother language days as sort of starters for dialogues rather than, you know, us coming up with a solution, because there is no solution that we could give anyone in 5 minutes. I think we've only got a few minutes left, but there is a question still in the Q&A that I think is mostly addressed to Naomi, but I think, you know, it could be, I think it will touch upon some of the things that all of you were saying, you know, maybe Vishnu and Fede and Tony. So this question is from, I don't know, an anonymous attendee. And they're asking, why is there an attainment gap when critical pedagogy doesn't assume a gap for minoritized children? Also, does talk rich assume that these children do not talk rich already, i.e. You want poor children to talk rich, words and terminology matter? Maybe this is I can't think of the word, a controversial question, I don't know.
No, it's all right. I think it's a good question, and I'm always grateful for people who make me think about my terminology. So it's okay. And there's a previous one as well about from the same person, I think, about teachers who are not themselves not from minority backgrounds. So we could take that one as well quickly, perhaps. Just to describe talk rich curriculum. You made me think now. So thanks for making me think. But talk rich is about actually about allowing children to say more and teachers shutting up. So it's not about that the children don't speak well, it's about that the teachers are saying too much, and we want to allow more space for children to be speaking and speaking at the same level or even higher than the teacher. So that's what that's about. In terms of why is there an attainment gap, despite the fact there being other than when we're using a critical sociocultural pedagogy, it's because those of us who are on a panel like this have the benefit of being researchers who understand that a critical sociocultural pedagogy does work, but that's not necessarily the norm in any of the countries in which we're researching. So the reason we're researchers and practitioners in the field trying to make those things work is because we're trying to change the status quo, as it were. So that's that issue. Did you want me to answer there's another question as well about?
I don't know if it's the same person, because anonymous attendee, I don't think is always.
Yeah, it could be. But there's another one saying, do you have any experience as teachers or schools who are advocates for minority children? Sorry, I'm doing your job, Ludo.
Sorry, no, I'm just saying it's an anonymous attendee. You could be the same anonymous attendee or another anonymous attendee. You can't assume that it's the same person. Anyway, they're talking about experience, and I'm assuming again it's directed to you, Naomi, because it talks about teachers in schools who are advocates for so-called minority children who do not come from a minority background themselves. I don't know if this is a problem or not.
So you mean the issue with the fact that the teaching profession is largely dominated by people who look and sound like I do? Yeah, it's a huge problem. I absolutely agree. But I do, just to answer the question very quickly, know of teachers who are those champions, those advocates for all of their children, whatever they bring to the classroom. And some of that will be advocates for their multilingual learners. Not everyone, I accept it's, it's not perfect. I have no rose-tinted spectacles about my own profession, but there are those people out there, and I'm working with a lot of them.
The question was actually from Ana Inés Heras, so she's identified herself.
Thanks,
so
Anna.
If Ana Inés wants to follow this up or not. Okay, in any case, in the interest of time, because it's 7:26 p.m. I don't know, Holly, I will hand over to you for general wrap up.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, everyone. I mean, I'm not allowed to answer questions, am I? But I was just going to say, I think part of what we need to do is acknowledge that, we live, as Vishnu says, we live in a racist society and we have racist systems, and we've got sort of short-term and longer-term goals, right? So we are not going to be able to eradicate all this prejudice by encouraging children to speak their first language in the classroom, right? We have to kind of think in small steps, and then we have to think long-term, and hopefully, in the long term, we will be able to improve things substantially, but we're very, very far from that time, aren't we? And I think part of what we have to do in this kind of self-reflection and acknowledgement is to accept that as a reality. Can Anika, I don't know if you want to do this, I don't want to embarrass you, but could you just come on camera so we can give you a little thank you, because you've been absolutely brilliant. Anika has, hello. Anika has moved the slides on better than whoever does it for Chris Whitty, I would say, and has been incredibly helpful in making this run so smoothly. So thank you very much, Anika, and thank you, of course, to the wonderful panel. I think it's been an amazing discussion. It has been brilliant questions and really, really thought-provoking answers. So thank you very much, and thank you very much, Ludo, for sharing those questions. Did you want to say something?
I do, because somebody in the chat says, would you, the panel, be happy to get in touch following this session for further discussions and questions? I'm assuming the answer is yes, and you will reply to all these emails and follow up. You've generated interest and discussion. Sorry about that, because I just wanted to reassure people that they can get in touch with you if they want to. They can read your papers and come to your conference.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't, we'll put this, we're going to upload this recording, we hope, to YouTube. I don't know if people included their emails or anything, but I mean, we're all very easily findable, aren't we? So please do get in touch, and we really want to sort of continue these discussions and talk about these issues. So, you know, anyone who's interested, and we'd love to hear from you. So thank you everyone for coming. It's been really great, and we hope to see you at the next event, which is in a couple of weeks. Bye.
Thank you.